Hey, everybody. Steve and I have over 20 years of experience as therapists and a whole lot longer than that as addicts in long-term successful recovery. We know better than anyone what works and what doesn't to break out of porn and sex addiction, to heal betrayal trauma, and to reclaim your relationship.
And we've gone ahead and poured all of our personal and professional recovery and healing experience into a first-of-its-kind program for addicts, spouses, and couples. We call it Dare to Connect.
At least 4 times every week, we engage with you in real time, in the trenches, giving you the knowledge and tools to take back your life and relationship.
Whatever else you guys have done on your journey for healing and recovery, we guarantee you have never done anything like this.
We've made all the mistakes so you don't have to. Please don't reinvent the wheel.
Guys, come on, let's get real. Tomorrow never really comes. Don't wait one more day to change. Claim your free 2-week trial today at daretoconnectnow.com. Hey everybody, I'm Steve Moore.
And I'm Mark Castleman.
We know the pain and heartbreak of porn and sex addiction.
And we know the triumph of breaking completely free.
Every day, we help our clients find hope and healing.
Join us in the fight to take back your life, your marriage, and be stronger than ever.
This is the PBSE Squared podcast. Hello, everybody. This is Steve Moore here. Welcome to the PBSE podcast today. My co-host, Mark Castleman, is actually out for the day. And so I'm going to be running this one solo. Today is going to be a good podcast. It's going to be a little bit different than a podcast that we usually do. In fact, I think this will be probably the first of its kind ever, actually, on the program. Even though Mark is out today, it was actually good timing for me because I had the privilege this last week of celebrating 8 years of sobriety. On October 13th, 2014, was the first day that I went long-term without my sexual addiction, sexual compulsion in place. October 12th, 2014 was the last time I ever turned to my addiction to cope. And I'm grateful to be here today, having celebrated those 8 years, and wanted to talk a little bit about that today. In 12-step groups and many fellowships, it's customary for one to share with the group when they're celebrating like a sobriety date or a sobriety milestone, I guess is what we call it, to talk about, how did you do it? And, what have you learned? How have you grown? Kind of to share some of those things. And I thought that today would be a nice opportunity to do that. Here on PBSE, we get lots of letters on a very frequent basis, emails from many of you expressing your gratitude for the podcast, which we, absolutely love to hear. We don't monetize this podcast, and so it really is an opportunity for Mark and I to be able to give back to those who are struggling. And, as the passion behind Dare to Connect for Mark and I lies in both the fact that we're both clinicians who specialize in pornography and sex addiction recovery, but we are passionate about it because we're both addicts in long-term recovery. And so often on a podcast like this, when you're, it is a clinician kind of led operation, much like with therapy itself, we focus so much on the problems, right? On the issues at hand, the different things at play, what's going on with this area of recovery versus that area of recovery, and how can we better things? For you, for our clients, what problems can we address today? What issues? That's typically how our podcast goes. And sometimes, just like in the therapy world, we spend so much time addressing the problem that we don't take the time to really talk about the solution, or specifically to celebrate, the other side of this process. Because recovery for both an addict and for a partner and anyone else who affected by something like sexual addiction and the betrayal trauma and the hurt and the heart and all the thinking errors and character defects and other things that sit behind it, I am convinced is one of the hardest journeys a person can take in life. There is so much to that journey, to that, as a colleague of mine once put it, to the fight for love. We fight for love in this business. We fight for connection. And so I wanted to talk a little bit today about that, to celebrate that, to talk about the other side of recovery, what I have found that has awaited Steve, 8 years into this process, the things that I've learned, the ways that I've grown, and maybe share some things with you, not just to give you some hope, but also to maybe speak to some of the things that I've learned along the way. And so that some of you listening maybe you won't have to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. So with that in mind, I'll just kind of start off. And I'm sitting here. I know none of you can see this, but as I'm talking to you, I'm actually holding the 8-year sobriety coin that I just got a few weeks back. It kind of helps me to stay grounded with the topic. For many of you who've listened to this podcast over the last couple of years, it's been around, much of my addiction history and my story. Had a very unique childhood and a lot of pretty traumatic experiences that happened as a kid. I'm a 2-time cancer survivor from a rare form of leukemia. And not too long after completing my second bout with that is when my dad passed away unexpectedly in a plane crash, which happened right around 13 at an age when I was very sexually curious. And it was kind of the perfect storm, is how I often term it on the podcast, for me, in terms of becoming hooked onto an addiction that made all of the pain and the anger and the sadness and the despair and the injusticeness. I don't know if that's a word, but the injustice, there we go. The injustice of the situation and how angry I was with God and everybody else. It made all that pain go away. And I've talked about oftentimes how I was hooked from day one. As I spent years stuck in this addiction in different ways, shapes, and forms, there were lots of things that came up for me along the way that, looking back, I wish I would have and could have if I'd made other decisions done differently. And the first is something that hopefully many of you have already done. But if you haven't, and maybe you haven't, because this is one of the ways in which podcasts can be so helpful, is to find somebody who you can trust, who would be safe, who knows you as you are and is willing to hear hard things and is able to see you for your good and your bad. Even if that is just like a support group, like a 12-step group, or a therapist, or maybe it is a trusted somebody in your life. But if you haven't already, please open up to somebody about this struggle. So much of what deepens and toxifies addiction and amplifies its implications is the emotional and in many cases even physical isolation that we addicts feel because of the unworthiness, the lack of self-worth, the hopelessness that we carry. We find ourselves struggling both to have the self-confidence to talk to other people, but also to have the self-worth that anybody would even want to associate with us. And those are really difficult obstacles to overcome. And the deeper we get into our addictions, the more isolated we become, the more shame deepens, the more our inability to see ourselves as a good person or someone of value, something to contribute, decreases. And so we, as some of the 12-step literature that I often study says, quote, we go ever deeper inward and we become lost inside ourselves. I think it's a great way to describe what happens in that addiction process. And so reaching out, shedding light on the issue, being transparent with someone, again, that you can trust, is a huge first step, if it hasn't been taken already, in terms of breaking out of this mess. And so that would be the first thing that I would definitely say. The second thing that comes to mind as I've gone through this process, and I look back on how I got to a place of solid recovery, was that I had to, may sound really weird, but I had to let go of my sobriety date and thinking about dates in general in this process. And for me, that was one of the things that had to happen before long-term recovery happened. I found that, and this is just for me, that the more I was tied to the date and how long I'd been sober, etc., the more I was also in kind tied to the people around me, looking good to them, looking like enough to my wife, being able to get praise from people about how good of a job I'd done, or, whatever the case was. And my ego was extremely fragile at the early stages of recovery. And I really struggled so much with my own self-worth and confidence that I got very tied up. And even as I was trying to do sincere recovery, I continued to remain really codependent on the perceptions and the, accolades or the lack thereof from other people. And the more I tend to focus on days, the more that tended to self-sabotage me from a mental perspective. I would become so perseverated on getting to 30 days of sobriety or 90 days of sobriety that oftentimes it would become an obsession and would pull me out of a headspace that I knew worked, which is what 12-step teaches, is that, recovery from an addiction really is a truly one day at a time process. It's not something that happens overnight, nor is it something that you can do, extremely quickly over time. Change is gradual, and consistency and putting in the daily work and focusing on what you can control today and letting go of the rest, not allowing the fear of the unknown, the fear of the future to overwhelm you. These are all common pitfalls that we find with the clients that we work with, and that's what I struggled with. And where I really began to get long-term traction in sobriety, where I really began to hit those sobriety dates, ironically, was the less I paid attention to them. It's when I marked it on a calendar somewhere that it wasn't something that I accessed often, and would announce in a meeting once a week in my support meeting. And other than that, I didn't really talk about it, because the goal, it didn't matter whether I'd been a day sober or a month sober or 5 years sober. The goal still remained the same: to access, find, discover, and implement the tools needed to find sobriety and to take the actions and steps to find authentic connection that day with myself, with my higher power, and with other people. And that still remains the same today as it did back then. And ironically, like I said, that's how I've gotten to where I'm at, is by letting go of those days. This last year, along with the last couple, were kind of interesting, because even though I knew my sobriety was coming up, and I'd recalled it a few times in meetings and stuff leading up to this last month of October, I remember I was actually sitting in a therapy session with one of my clients, and we were talking about sobriety, and all of a sudden it popped into my head, oh my gosh, today's my 8-year sobriety date. And I'd just completely forgotten about it, which in many ways, not in a cavalier or a casual way, not that I don't care, but it was good for me. It was healthy to be able to say, today I'm just living more of a recovery lifestyle. And these dates kind of are a way to track that, as opposed to I'm living for the date, if that makes sense. So that was a huge other piece that was really important for me. A third component, and I wish somebody had told me this sooner, was I wish somebody had been around, and I wish I'd accessed or found someone to help me paint a vision for what life could be like outside of addiction. By the time I got serious about recovery, even when I got serious about it, I only was able to get so serious about it. And the reason why is because deep down, when my back was up against the wall and I kind of had no choice to get serious about this or lose my marriage, those were kind of the choices. Even as I tried to get serious about it, I truly didn't believe that I could get better. I'd been caught in this mess and this awful cycle for so long, by that point, 20-something years, that the idea that I could actually be done with this or finished with this just didn't even resonate for me anymore. The idea that I could really be free of addiction, that I could move forward in my life, that I could find happiness and connection with other people. I mean, it was just such a foreign concept. My whole adult life had been wrapped up in this life of escape and living a two-faced lifestyle. I told a client the other day, I was like the sexual Batman of my world. Like by day, I was like this good, religious, awesome husband. And by night, I was like this sexual dark knight who was, had this whole other way of living and coping and numbing out and escaping. And I spent so much time trying to live those two lives that even knowing what it could be like to be sober and to be happy and healthy was actually quite foreign. And as I started to get traction in sobriety, I started little by little to gain little bits and peaks into, little tidbits of feelings or emotions or viewpoints of, what could this be like? What could life maybe be like? As I hit 3 months of sobriety and then miraculously 6 months of sobriety, I was starting to get a taste even if it was just in little pieces of, what being a little less shame-based and a little less caught into my own stuff could be like. And I just clung to those when I got those little pieces of insight. And I wish that sooner on I had availed myself and connected myself with somebody who could get it, and somebody who was willing to not judge, and somebody who could give me support without judging me. That's what I was looking for. And, as I look at these different things, I mean, these are the pieces of the pie. These are just some of the pieces of the pie that were so important. Being able to let go of my own paradigm, learning how to surrender the 12-step skill that we talk oftentimes about in our Dare to Connect program, learning how to surrender that old paradigm, that old way of thinking, and recognize, even just for a minute, the possibility that maybe what my experience has taught me isn't as true as I think it is. Maybe I can get better. Maybe in some ways I've been living kind of the sexual addiction version of the Truman Show, where, everything that I've kind of known is not completely true, and that there could be something better out there. Sobriety for me is one of the most precious gifts that I have. It is the gate through which so much of my life, professionally and personally, flows. Everything from the ability to look clients in the eye who are struggling and say, we will get you to a better place, to being able to show up and engage in my marriage, to just even being connected with myself and then being able to connect with life and not be numbed out and tuned out all the time. I remember so well what that was like, to be living in this place of causing my wife ever more and more and more pain, and dragging myself and my relationship into deeper and darker places. Those elements and those purposes, I'm so grateful to have, stepped away from that gradually over time, and to be in a place now where I have a life, frankly, that is exponentially better than I ever thought it could have been. There are so many, these reasons, these things that I'm talking about, and I could just go on and on today. We won't for sake of time, but are just one of the many reasons why Mark and I founded the PBSE, the Porn, Betrayal, Sex, and the Experts podcast a couple of years back. About 3 years ago, actually, now is what we're coming up on. That's why we first put it together. And after seeing the success of that, we decided to take that to a new level, to take it to a deeper level. And about 18 months ago, after years in the making, we launched our recovery program, Dare to Connect, for addict spouses and couples. Every week on that program, we spend an hour with addicts on Mondays, an hour with partners on Wednesdays, and an hour with couples on Fridays, getting raw and real with you about every topic relating to addiction and recovery and betrayal trauma under the sun, addressing questions, giving clients answers, speaking with the best clinical mix that we can come up with of clinical insight, but also mixed with real life, raw and real recovery history and experience. And now we have recently just added, in addition to that, a 90-minute support group for partners of addicts, and a 90-minute support group for addicts themselves that is largely 12-step based, although we integrate lots of other stuff that is facilitated directly by myself and Mark. We're the ones that monitor and run those groups personally along with other staff members. Those are on Sundays as well now. And our goal here at Dare to Connect progressively, and we continue to work on that mission, is to create a place, to create the place, frankly, that I needed and that Mark needed when we were struggling and our marriage was on the rocks and we didn't know where else to go. And we tried 50 other programs and other things before. We needed something, and we didn't have it at the time. We were grateful to both become acquainted with 12-step. I got in with a good therapist, and Dare to Connect, it never has been, nor will it ever be, a replacement for one-on-one therapy. But we have tried as much as we can outside of that one-on-one therapy realm to create a one-stop shopping environment for addicts and their spouses, where you can find hope and healing with a couple of therapists who have been there before and know what that's like. A place where you can associate with and interact with other couples who are in the trenches working recovery the same as you are. We hope that you guys will come out and join us. There's a 2-week free trial that we have going on for the program to come out and see it. Take a look, see if you like it. You can find that at daretoconnectnow.com. That's DARE Daretoconnectnow.com, daretoconnectnow.com. We'd love to have you guys come out and give it a try. But I am just, at any rate, I am just grateful to be here with each of you and for the privilege it is to show up here on this podcast and to gratefully say I've been sober for over 8 years now. I have no idea what the future brings or holds for me, but I do know that as I continue to live a recovery-based lifestyle one day at a time, life is becoming a better and brighter prospect than I've ever known. I know all too well that many of you don't find yourself in that place today, and I hope that today's podcast will create and maybe help to instill maybe some motivation for you addicts. Maybe it'll instill some motivation. Maybe it will help to create a vision for couples out there that you really can get better. That there's a life beyond recovery, that for you addicts, there really is a last time. And the question just becomes is when do you want to make it your last time? Mark and I, we care so much about all of our listeners. We appreciate hearing from you. We love getting questions from you. If there are any questions you would like to address on an upcoming podcast, we have a couple of our next episodes lined up, but we'd love to hear from you. You can send those to us through our contact form at pbsepodcast.com. There's a little contact form at the bottom. You can send us your story. We're happy to address those, always anonymously or just with using a first name only on the podcast. We would love to tackle any issues that you're having. And again, would love to see you. If you like what you hear here on the podcast, if you like the authenticity and the realness, please come check us out at daretoconnectnow.com. We'd love to have you come join the D2C family and be able to interact, engage with you, and help you along on your recovery journey back to a happy life, a happy marriage, either a return back to it, or if you're like me, to find it for the first time. Hope that you guys have a great rest of your week. We look forward to hearing from you. And again, as always, as we move into the holiday season, just want to express our gratitude and love for each of you. We have listeners all over the globe in over 165 countries now, which is, I'll be honest with you, up until we started this podcast, I didn't know there were 165 countries in the world. I didn't know there were so many. But it's just a privilege to be interacting, engaging with each of you. And we look forward to engaging with you more in the future. Have a great week, everybody, and we will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Everything expressed on the PBSE podcast are the opinions of the hosts and the participants and is for informational and educational purposes only. This podcast should not be considered mental health therapy or as a substitute thereof. It is strongly recommended that you seek out the clinical guidance of an individual qualified mental health professional. If you're experiencing thoughts of suicide, self-harm, or a desire to harm others, please dial 911 or go to your nearest emergency room.